Okay, we'll start, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for attending this webinar. One of our guest speakers is having trouble connecting. As soon as they connect, he will join us at that time, obviously. So for compliance purposes, I'd like to remind everyone that this webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be made available to those who've registered for the talks, as well as the general public. We'll be publishing this on our social media channels. First, I'd like to thank our guests. I'll do that in a bit, but welcome everyone to another edition of the NSSG Talks. Today, we have a kind of a really awesome pair of analysts at the moment. Hopefully we'll have a third one joining us. And I think it's right appropriate that we are talking about Ukraine, seeing that the 2-year anniversary has just passed. The war has kind of left an indelible mark on a lot of industries and sectors in the risk management space, particularly with geopolitics, politics, security, geoeconomics as well. And we have an excellent bunch of panelists here that are going to kind of provide their insights, both from a kind of an outsider's perspective, but some of those outsiders have actually been to Ukraine, as well as an insider's perspective as well. Today, we are waiting for Mr. Ian Thornton Trump, who's the CISO of UK-based cybersecurity company Cyjax. On the line with us now is Dr. Paul Thornbury, a lecturer in criminology at Bath Spa University in the UK, and Mr. Mykola Mikiev, chair of ACES International Ukraine chapter, and he's also a security officer for the EU assistance mission in Ukraine, who's joining us from Ukraine at the moment. My name is Joe Frederick. I'm a senior consultant with NSSG, and I'll be today's moderator. Before we get into today's discussion, if I could have Mykola and Dr. Thornbury kind of give a brief introduction about themselves, their experiences in the kind of the security space, and as it relates to the kind of Ukraine. Mykola, how about if you go first, then we'll go to Dr. Thornbury.
Thank you for giving me the floor. It's my pleasure to be a guest of this talks. As you said, my name is Mykola Mikiev. I'm speaking from Ukraine. I'm chapter chair of ACES Ukraine. Initially, I was trained as an officer, military officer of late time of Soviet Union. And when Soviet Union collapsed, I decided to return to Ukraine from greater Soviet Union territory. And I started to serve as officer forces. But it was a time when Ukraine actively downsized army, and I lost the job in armed forces, and I was switching to law enforcement agencies. And I spent 16 years in various law enforcement agencies, including Interpol and Customs Services. I was also seconded to a Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and I was legal attaché, one of the embassy of Ukraine at Middle East. I'm also educated with UK Defense Academy, and after redundancy, retirement from governmental services, I start my security services in private sector. I was seconded to private military contract security companies in Iraq and Afghanistan, and later I was working in Ukraine for NGO sector. So my primary expertise is consulting for NGO and IGO, intergovernmental organization in Ukraine, about business continuity, emergency services, close protection, executive protection, and travel security. Thank you for offering me to be part of this valuable talks. What is yours?
Thank you, Mykola. Paul, how about you?
Yeah, thanks, Joe. So I'm Paul Thornbury. I'm a lecturer in criminology at Bath Spa University. I like Mykola, originally started out my journey as a military officer in the British Army, and so I sort of caught the end of the Northern Ireland era and the end of the Cold War as well, and spent much of my military service in areas of the Balkans and Eastern Europe. I then moved on to work during the late 1990s and early 2000s in both the NGO and the security risk management sector in Russia and the Caucasus. And so I lived and worked across the Russian Federation at a time when that was still a possibility. And when Russia was really making the pivotal move from the Yeltsin era to an era where it became obvious that a more authoritarian form of control was being implemented when Putin came back into power. I left Russia in 2007 and pursued an academic career. My academic work, I gained my PhD from the London School of Economics, looking at private military and security activity. And my research really focuses on private military security and what we call the crime conflict nexus, which means I look across literature that relates to policing, relates to military sociology, relates to organized crime, and relates to terrorism. And we try to understand what the relationship is between criminality, warfare, policing, and conflict. And a lot of my focus, needless to say, is on areas of Eastern Europe and the Russian Federation. I've recently travelled to Ukraine, which has given me a small insight, but I will enjoy listening in particular to Mikola and the other guests as well, to gain more knowledge myself about what is definitively a developing but seminal period of time in our history.
Yeah, I think that's a good point to end on, Paul. A kind of seminal moment in history. I use the term like how this Ukraine war has left a kind of indelible mark on a lot of the kind of spaces that we're interested in at the moment, and that we're hopefully going to discuss. And academics such as yourselves will be kind of waxing lyrical about this conflict for decades and decades and decades. And so for the kind of complexities that is kind of introduced in the kind of risk management space. So while we're still waiting for Ian, we'll just continue on here. I'll just kind of present a brief overview of some critical events that have happened since independence in 1991. And some of these, I won't go into this great detail. I myself am not a Ukraine expert, so but some of these events seem to will have kind of resonance today, I'd say, and perhaps had some of these events kind of turned in Ukraine's favor, we probably wouldn't be here talking today about the Ukraine conflict. And so I think at the top of the list, aside from independence, was that in 1994 there was the Budapest Memorandum, which was essentially a non-proliferation agreement where the Ukrainian government at the time had agreed to transfer all this Soviet-era nuclear hardware and weaponry back to the Russian Federation, basically. And at that time, there was a kind of commitment to recognize the sovereignty of the Ukraine state as well. And then we go to 2008, where at a NATO summit, there was discussion about Ukraine joining NATO. And so they had put together kind of a membership action plan, which the Russian government at the time had kind of protested against. And because of that protest and probably some other things as well, the membership action plan was never really offered to Ukraine at the time. And then since that time, we had a series of kind of protests and elections that had happened, the EuroMaidan protests. We had the Orange Revolution as well, where at the time it seems as if candidates were either leaning towards the Russian side or the kind of pro-Western side, basically. And it became very clear that after the EuroMaidan protest, that there was this kind of great emphasis amongst the electorate, I guess a great majority of the electorate, who wanted to kind of side with the pro-Western side, who wanted to side with having a pro-Western kind of political side. So, and that became a kind of source of grievance with the Russian government. And after the EuroMaidan protests we had in 2014 in the spring, early spring, we had a kind of great mobilization of Russian forces, basically, which kind of culminated in the seizure of Crimea, the peninsula just to the south of Ukraine, which is still being kind of occupied by Russian forces. Fast forward to 2019, relatively unknown in political space, Volodymyr Zelensky became president, and he began to initiate a kind of crackdown on pro-Russian oligarchs, including those that were kind of close to the Putin regime and Vladimir Putin himself. This kind of triggered another mass mobilization along the borders of Ukraine and Russia, and that kind of culminated into the invasion that happened just over 2 years ago. And then since that time, there's been a lot of coverage on the kind of movements, the battlefield movements in Ukraine. I think the overall message that everyone's been able to take from this is that Ukraine has been kind of very resilient in the kind of pushing back Russian forces, whereas in the kind of preamble, the pre-war phases, there was a lot of kind of pessimism as to whether or not how long Ukraine could kind of stay resilient and kind of fight back any kind of Russian invasion. But on its own and with some aid as well, Ukraine has done kind of remarkably well. Since the invasion, there's been a kind of series of tit for tat kind of activities, which has kind of dictated the kind of pace of events in the conflict. Of significant note is the October 2022 bombing of the bridge that linked Crimea with Russia. There was also the ushering in of a kind of new presidential administration in the U.S. with Joe Biden, and that seemed to exchange a series of kind of diplomatic kind of visits. Zelensky visited the White House. He also had a kind of visit to Congress as well. And that was kind of exchanged months later when Biden took this kind of, historic visit to an active conflict zone. That was kind of a very arduous trip as well. Fast forward to 2024, we had a military shakeup, and I'm hoping that I can end there and have kind of Mikola's kind of thoughts and opinions on the recent activities within the Zelensky administration regarding the kind of leadership change, as well as the most recent comments by French President Macron about the potential for to deploy his own forces into that Ukrainian theater as well. Mikola, would you care to comment? Mikola, are you there?
Oh, I think we've lost the link with Mikola.
Okay, Paul, how about if you could probably interject with that? Any comments?
Yeah. Oh,
yes.
Checking 1 2 1 2.
Oh, we got Ian as well.
I think we've got Ian.
Perfect.
So that's good. No, I mean, thanks for that that rundown, Joe. I think the developments with Macron are potentially indicative of a split that there appears to be among Western nations between those administrations who realize the seriousness of the ongoing situation and those who have perhaps not taken on board the extent to which we are in a pivotal period that may involve some very stark decisions about the extent to which Western nations are prepared to get behind Ukraine at a time when the headwinds are looking like getting potentially much more difficult. And I think what that is in part the result of is a misunderstanding that was perhaps born by the very, very positive news that came out of Ukraine immediately after the Russian invasion, the so-called special military operation, where Ukrainian forces were able to achieve very significant reverses against what seemed like a much greater and more powerful Russian military intervention, and subsequently then again the recapture of areas around Kharkiv. But I think that led the West to believe that commitment to Ukraine in a longer attritional conflict was going to be possible without the type of all-in commitment that President Macron is articulating may be necessary. And I think there are responses which indicate that risk aversion by other Western players and a failure to understand the gravity of the situation is still leading to some hedging, where there will have to be a greater focus taken by some other Western powers, where they understand that it really is a situation of either moving towards an unfavourable set of negotiations or throwing weight behind Ukraine in a way which to date they have not felt able or have been too risk averse to be prepared to do.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. I'd like to thank Ian for joining us. Ian, I've just kind of ended with this timeline here about this recent military shakeup, as well as recent comments by Macron about the potential deployment of French forces into this particular theater, which Paul was kind of commenting on. I'd like to give Mikola a chance to comment on it as well. I know he's having kind of connection issues, but Mikola, if you can go ahead.
Yes, can you hear me? I'm here. Thank you for giving me the floor, if you can hear me. First of all, Paul, thank you for kind of introduction and your view on Ukraine and Ukraine's resilience. And I would start to say that Ukraine resilience surprised not only the European nation, but even Ukrainians itself. I remember the first days of the conflict, February of 2022, and many of people were ready to stood to the end and fight to the Russian forces in spite of the TV propaganda from neighboring Russia saying that Ukraine will fall down in 3 days. But in reality, nowadays in 2024, Ukraine nation and Ukraine armed forces very depends on support on European nation and United States, as well as UK, our allies. And yes, we already, as Ukrainians, fight to the end, to the last Ukrainians, but we really need support and backup of European nation with ammunition, weaponry system, and logistics support. And we really see ourselves, Ukrainians, as a protection of European nation from barbarian behavior of Russian. Unfortunately, many Ukrainians and Eastern Russian European nations, we also learned the history of First World War, where Russia Empire were brutal in Poland and in Eastern Europe. And as Ukrainian, I keep support the words of my president that Russia would not stop in Ukraine and will continue attack European nations. So therefore, Ukraine will continue to fight for existence, because for us this is existential war for supporting our nation and for living for good of Ukrainian nation, Ukrainian people. But we also believe that we are helping Europe to realize what Russia threat is, and to help Europe to find their solution and unite it against the threat of the Russia. Thank you. Giving floor back to the studio.
Ian, do you have anything to add to that?
Oh, yeah, I have so much. So much. Apologies, we had a major internet outage plagued the area, both cellular tower and tetherable. So that didn't work out. I had to hoof it and do a 15-minute mile. And in my shape, at my young age, a 15-minute mile is a bit of a challenge. So apologies again to the panel. What I do have to say is France is a really interesting dynamic, and it's interesting because they have this little thing called the French Foreign Legion, and it's literally not France, but kind of France, that they could deploy into the Ukraine to bolster the Ukrainian defenses without suffering any sort of national blowback, because of the long history that the French Foreign Legion has had in, shall we say, extrajudicial capabilities in Africa and around the world. So it's perhaps one of the only European nations that could put troops on the ground without putting troops on the ground, which is a really interesting paradigm. Listen, and I'll sum it up in the most eloquent way that I can say is that if we don't support Ukraine in this war, we better start supporting Poland and the Baltics, because that's what's coming next. There's no question in my mind that Vladimir Putin wants to rekindle the idea of the Russian Empire, going back to the epic, shall we say, of the Cold War. I believe that this is not only a war of attrition, but it is a characteristic invasion by various stages, and it's to the benefit of the Ukrainian people, because right now they form the bulwark of our defenses against Russian expansion and Russian outright imperialism. Having said all that, there is some amazing changes going on in the dynamic of the battlefield that we've seen. We can get in those a little bit later, Joe, with other stuff, but that's sort of my opening statement on the position that I have towards things, and I would love to see more support for Ukraine in any form that can be mustered.
Yeah, that's interesting. I guess, so do any of you see this kind of a more kind of unilateral approach to this kind of interventionism, if you will? I mean, the French Foreign Legion is a great example. I imagine they just need a kind of the approval from the French government and they're on their way, basically. But could there be, but what would that mean, though? I mean, how much of an impact could they make, on the battlefield and in the kind of, I guess, public relations space as well, because undoubtedly this can be spun either way, right? And so, the Russian government could take this to mean a more kind of hostile, aggressive posture, and then, and kind of utilize its more asymmetrical warfare to kind of, look at the Baltics, for example, or elsewhere in this kind of region. So, this whole unilateral approach. What do you guys think about this?
If you allow me to say a few words, it's Mikola. First of all, before this conflict starts, many European nations doesn't realize how big Ukraine is and what Ukraine is consist of. We are 40 million population before the war. We are probably 20 millions only now in Ukraine. And the territory and distance in Ukraine is so big that we are bigger than France and Germany together. So potentially, Ukraine before the war was seen by French and Germans like a little Russians, if I say so. But now really this war and behavior of Vladimir Putin supported rise of new Ukrainian nation, which is really realize who we are, and we are really part of European Union, or we want to be part of European Union, that we're different to Russians. And therefore, I'm absolutely agree to previous speakers that I'm really keen to see the change in attitude of French president and especially Germans, who are now more and more support Ukraine and realize that Ukraine is countermeasure to the Russia to some extent. So basically, I'm happy to see that many European leaders see Ukraine as a nation, as a different to the Russians, and as a one of the way or counterfeit Russia in their imperialistic behavior. Floor is yours.
Yeah, I would pick up on Ian's point about the fact that if there is not a change in focus by some European nations at this stage, then a plan will have to be put in place to provide the similar type of support that we saw in the start of this conflict towards the Baltic states and potentially Poland. So I do think we are at a moment where minds need to be focused. I think part of the problem is that there was a misinterpretation at the early stages of the conflict about the nature of the Russian intervention and the extent to which Russia would be subsequently prepared to move to full-on industrial warfare against Ukraine and ultimately against what it sees as a NATO alliance that it has cast in its information space as a predatory alliance that it is proposing threatens the Russian Federation itself. And so Russia has moved to a footing where it has made this for its own purposes an existential conflict, and both radicalized and mobilized its population upon that premise. I think that in the initial stages, Russia was actually intending to do in Ukraine what it had done in Georgia in 2008, and what we had seen it do in a number of other areas, going back to Slatina Airport in Kosovo in 1999, where it had a policy of using a mixture of punitive raids and coup de main operations to achieve some form of regime change or discipline what it saw as its kind of Soviet colonial spaces. And the initial invasion into Ukraine was about 190,000 Russian troops. And that may have been enough had Ukraine not had the gumption, character, and stubborn commitment to its own independence that we saw in that period. That may have been enough to have achieved the aim of a sort of punitive regime change raid, but it didn't work. And I think one of the problems in the West was that the assumption was that the Ukrainians had managed to fight off a full-scale industrial invasion by Russia, and that a similar level of support that was provided in those initial stages would be enough to sustain a conflict against Russia. And I think what subsequently happened is Russia has moved into industrial conflict. It has mobilized its population, it has conscripted people, as if what it is doing is not just fighting Ukraine, but fighting the whole of NATO. And that has led to an attritional conflict that requires a great deal more support than Western nations have really been able to realize. If Russia has fully mobilized, it will require a full-scale mobilization on behalf of the West to counter that threat. And I think some nations are further forward in that thinking. Macron, I think, would be one. And some nations are much more risk averse and are trying to propose that there is a long-term form of thinking where you're going to see an accommodation in some way with an expansionist Russia. I think the Germans are probably in that camp at the moment, and you see those fault lines develop. I think the worst case scenario, and I'd be interested to get Mikola's view, I think the Ukrainian defense has been absolutely tenacious and innovative, and you've seen huge advances in the way warfare is being conducted. But you are facing an industrial power that are outproducing Ukraine in the West in certain critical areas, like, for instance, artillery ammunition. A worst case scenario would be that elements of the Ukrainian line start to fail and we see Russian maneuver. And I think in that worst case scenario, and I'm not saying that this is something necessarily which is imminent, but I do think in planning terms, people in the West should be aware of that as a potential worst case scenario, that you may have to move Western troops into areas which do not rub right up with the confrontation line, but place NATO aligned forces, perhaps in a non-NATO capacity, in areas where they are not coming into direct conflict, but provide bilateral security guarantees to the Kiev government and permit there to be a position where any further advance into Ukrainian territory would risk the Russians coming into direct contact with NATO-aligned nations, with the potential or ambiguity over whether that would trigger an Article 5 response by NATO as a whole. And I think there have been rumors that discussions like that have been going on about a contingency plan, were it to be the case that because of the slightly muted commitment, elements of the Ukrainian front line end up being more frail than perhaps we had anticipated them being. And so one doesn't want to be a Cassandra or provide an overly negative interpretation. But I think perhaps it'd be useful to maybe get Mikola's view on whether that is an accurate sort of prognosis.
Thank you, Paul. If you can hear me, if I may take from here, and you said something which is amazed me about supporting Poland and Baltic states nowadays, and you're absolutely right. If Ukraine will fall down, the next conflict line of the Putin will be definitely Baltic states and Poland. He definitely said it, that Russia would be ready to return what belongs to them. It's the Baltic states. Putin still thinks that Baltic states are the part of the Soviet Empire, and Poland, which was divided twice historically in 300 years by Russian Empire. But one thing which is maybe not many people realize, that Putin is so obsessed with history and so obsessed with not understanding the Ukrainian nation, that in his view, probably he was thinking that when he will take over Ukraine, he will pacify Ukrainian population, and Ukrainian population ultimately will become a part of his army, which can move further into Europe. So remember, I said at the beginning that I was initially trained as a military officer in late Soviet Union years. And then when Soviet Union collapsed, Ukraine had a 1 million army, which was only portion of about 4 million Soviet Union army. So Ukraine, when it doesn't need to have this 1 million army, it went through the stages of downsizing with support of NATO to probably 200,000. And nowadays we have 1,100,000 of armed forces which are fighting with Russians in Ukraine against of the Russian. So just imagine, in worst case scenario, if Ukraine will fall down and Putin will occupy not all Ukraine, but at least a bigger part of Ukraine, what would this 1 million soldiers do? And probably some will go to resistance, to partisan war, but some would not have a job, not would have income, and Putin probably still dreamed to pacify this 1 million army and try to make as a part of the foreign legion of Russian army and use this army against of Europe, against of Poland and Baltic states. So I don't want to scare my colleague or my panelists, but I'm saying that it's better to support Ukraine to the ultimate ends with ammunition, with logistics support, and probably the idea of Macron have some legitimate idea that Ukraine can be divided as a Korea or GDR and Germany, and if part of the territory of Ukraine, we would have their occupational forces, not or any kind of forces of bilateral NATO nations or some other nations, it might give us support and extra protection against the Russia. Floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Mikola. Before, I know you want to say something, Ian, and I'll let you have a word. We do have a couple of questions, and we'll get to those at the end of the discussion. So the other thing I want to point out is I want to talk a bit about cybersecurity. Ian's a cybersecurity expert. And then we'll talk about more the geopolitical angle, which we've been kind of touching upon throughout this discussion so far. And there was a topic that we discussed the other day about this, about the notion of a kind of World War III, basically. And Paul and Ian had some really useful insights on that. So thanks for the questions. We will get to them at the end of the discussion. So sorry, Ian, go ahead.
Okay, so I like a little bit on the cyber piece and then talk a little bit about the story arc. Like in 2015 in Op Syria, where essentially there was a call to action in the wake of the Arab Spring, where cyber activists on both sides of the equation engaged in a prolonged cyber campaign involving everything from disruption of national critical infrastructure and targeting any aspect of vulnerability that a country has. Ukraine knew this was coming. It started in 2014. There were working groups established in NATO to provide Ukraine with assistance. Western technology was actively engaged because I think everyone at NATO and in the United States realized that there's going to be a massive component of cyber involved in any future conflict. And this goes back to what Paul said about the Georgian attack, where there was cyber working directly alongside Russian kinetic operations. Ukraine has been amazingly resilient in its ability to deal with these cyber attacks with a great deal of Western support, and offensively project, as a result of the IT army and a number of other, I'm going to say, sympathetic Western activist groups, which have attacked Russia and have been responsible for a great deal of embarrassment and intellectual property theft. And in the early stages of the war, one of the stories that Ukraine can be very proud of was their ability to infiltrate some of the most secure systems in Russia and exfiltrate data about Russian operations and intelligence services across Europe. So this has been an espionage campaign. It's been a kinetic warfare cyber type of campaign. And of course, it has been a massive amounts of disinformation on either side. So I think from my perspective, the cyber war aspect to this is one of the most interesting parts of how this conflict has gone and is now, very present on the world stage. Having said that, cyber attacks cannot seize ground. That's the work of the infantry and armies. So it's counterbalanced a little bit from the amazing advancements and use of the doctrine that we adopted in the counterterrorism activities, in scoring some big wins against Russian capital assets like the ships, as well as some of the top leadership in Ukraine. So the aspect of this, I think, that's really important and maybe perhaps a bit confusing for the audience, is that cyber has played a massive role in both the success and the defense of the Ukraine, but it is not a game like a game winner. It is a supporting cast member, and I think what we really need to do, and I think I'm hearing this very clearly from the panel of guests, is at the end of the day, this has become a war of attrition and looks a lot like, in places, what we suffered through at the turn of the century with, of course, World War II or World War I. And I think fundamentally where we are right now is that we have to maintain the pressure on Russia, increase the pressure on Russia. And I'll also point out with the fact NATO has an incredible capability and toolkit. We haven't seen stealth aircraft that we know of deployed in the Ukrainian theater. We have not had an extensive SED campaign, which is essentially a campaign designed to destroy any sort of Russian emitting radar. There is a lot that NATO can bring to the table should we need to. And I think what we need to decide, and I think Marcone opened the door to discussions on that, is what does winning look like in Ukraine? And it's time to have that discussion and time to push those assets forward. And I don't think we're passing the red line. And I know Russia has made through their deputy prime minister some noises about if we cross this red line of restoring Ukraine to its 2014 borders. I think, honestly, that is what winning looks like. The problem is the aftermath, rebuilding Ukraine on one side, but then dealing with what essentially is the largest failed state adjacent to Europe that we've ever seen, which would be Russia in the post-Ukrainian conflict. So it's going to be a very difficult and long haul. I expect this campaign, this battle right now has entered the World War II Sitzkrieg stage, where tactically there's advantages in particular areas of the battlefield, and sometimes kind of strategic wins in the form of a country without a navy managing to sink Russian capital ships, which is absolutely mind-blowing. And I think every NATO planner that works in anything to do with water is looking at this conflict going, oh, wow, that's something we had never thought of. So there's a lot to take away from this, but but I'll just sort of sum up my remarks on this particular aspect. With cyber is something that I think has added an extra dimension to warfare at this stage, and what we've seen the Russians do and what Western responses have been brings us to a place where this is, in a sense, a global conflict, because anyone can participate for whichever side that they believe in. And if you think for a moment that the Russians haven't looked at their sort of allies being Iran, North Korea, and potentially China as being helpful in the cyber department, I think you're not seeing the whole chessboard. Because I think where we are right now is it is Western capabilities aligned against Russian and friends capabilities, and the hacktivist community is really engaged. And this is a very difficult thing to navigate for any military planner. There's always a sense of the unknown, but right now I think the unknown has really got a huge cyber element.
Yeah, thanks for that, Ian. I think there are two concepts that you just kind of mentioned there. One was pressure and the fact that this has become like a global conflict, basically. And so that means that pressure has to come from different directions, right? And so I know we talked about this earlier, Paul and Ian, about kind of, what's been able to kind of sustain Russia's effort into this war is more the kind of the economic aspect. And the implication is that there's been this kind of shifting of these alliances as well. And so, Paul, could you kind of present us with your insights on that?
So I think there's probably two elements to fall out of this. One is to do with maritime implications, which I'll go into. But the first one, I think, is also to do with defense industrial capability. And some of the big imbalances that we have seen in either the preparedness or the capability of NATO and Western nations to ramp up production in certain key areas of combat consumables and defense supplies, and get them to Ukraine in useful timeframes. And there are some interesting tensions which are both structural and political here. If we look at artillery ammunition, which is one of the key things which is needed to win ground offensives, we have consistently seen Ukraine have to manage with less artillery ammunition than would normally be considered necessary to provide counter-battery fire to suppress and move themselves into offensive military operations. And the supply chains there have been complicated by different weapon systems, 155mm on the NATO side, 152 on the Soviet side. But actually getting production ramped up in a way that gets those shells to Ukraine hasn't happened as effectively as one would hope it could. And there seems to be some of that is to do with risk aversion. Rheinmetall, we understand, are moving into production in Ukraine itself, but have actually been in a position where they have come under some pressure allegedly come under some pressure, not to provide the full scale and scope of production that they could do, because there are political considerations about escalation. On the other side, in certain areas of defence where we've seen there's some real advantage for NATO, you see procurement systems that are oriented around the delivery of shareholder value, but which disincentivize the commitment of those weapon systems into an active conflict environment, whether that's to do with circumspection, to do with technology transfer if weapon systems are captured, or whether it's just to do with the fact that the contracting and procurement systems that we've got tend to reward long-term logistics contract associated with storage rather than actually getting weapons into a position where they can be used. And so I think there's a question about whether the structural procurement mechanisms that we have sort of developed in defense industries in the post-Fordian era are capable of ramping up and providing us with collective defense in the way that we saw prior to the end of Fordism, during the World War II era, where it was easier for governments to turn around and say, this factory is now producing shells, do it and do it to the maximum capability that you possibly can do. Going through market mechanisms is creating friction, which is making that more difficult. And we may have a big question to ask ourselves about whether our defence procurement and defence industries are capable in their current structure of ramping up in the way that we will need them to provide effective deterrence against new forms of industrialized warfare. I think the second issue is to do with the maritime situation, and this touches not just on Ukraine but on the Middle East. There's been an extraordinary position. I think cyber and maritime are very similar. I think one of the old maritime strategists said, wars are won on land, but they can be lost at sea. And I think that's the same for cyber as well. And I think there's some extraordinary success stories that have gone on with regard to maritime operations and maritime special warfare operations. That's been one of the areas that we've seen huge innovation and some extraordinary things done. But there's another story to Ukraine and the maritime situation, which is 1 in 7 sailors globally at the start of this conflict was either Russian or Ukrainian. And so we had a merchant maritime fleet that was actually disproportionately tied to the two territories that we now see in conflict. And there was about 2,000 sailors who were trapped in Ukraine at the start of the conflict on something like 200 ships. And a huge operation was put in place by Lloyd's of London to get those sailors out, partly because they were needed to keep global shipping working. The mechanism that was put in place to implement Russian sanctions, the $60 cap on Russian oil, was designed to keep a sufficient amount of Russian oil floating around the international system, but at a price whereby Russia would not profit from the war. And the way that was policed was that the P&I clubs in Lloyd's, the insurance clubs in Lloyd's, would look at the insurance of tanker transits, and they would identify whether the oil on board those tanker transits was being sold below or above the stipulated price. And that worked while the Lloyd's P&I clubs were maintaining a monopoly over the international shipping market. More recently, we've seen the expansion of what we call the dark fleet. And the dark fleet is a fleet of about 450 to 600 ships, mostly 30 to 40 years old, who are operating outside maritime governance systems, beyond the reach of the International Maritime Organization. They are not being underwritten by Lloyd's, and therefore what they are able to do is transport goods and commodities outside the international system of governance. And about 12.5% of tanker capacity now exists outside that governance mechanism. What I think that means for us is that the traditional method that we have used short of kinetic activity and deploying armed forces to maintain international law and the international rules-based order, which has been sanctions, is becoming less tenable. It is becoming less feasible to do that because mechanisms have now been developed to obviate it. And I think that will have an ongoing impact on the ability of Western nations and more broadly the Brookings institutions and the sort of settlement around international movements of capital and goods. It will make that more difficult to enforce through soft power means. And I think that's going to be defining as we go forward. And that's a direct result, I think, of this conflict that we are now engaged in.
I want to just jump in and just add a few things to Paul for context. So this is a huge, huge issue, and sanctions that we initially put in have proved to be degraded as a result of Russia, China, Iran, and to a certain extent North Korea avoiding any touch with the American banking system and the American clearing houses, and as Paul rightly pointed out, insurance mechanisms for this transit. There's an ecological disaster that could happen at any moment with those 400 to 600 ships that are in some cases 40 or 50 years old. that there is no insurance mechanism in place to pay for damages that are associated with that. I in a kind of a fevered dream, I'd like to see a Ukrainian U-boat captain start going after these on a global scale, but unfortunately, Ukraine is somewhat constrained as having no subsurface assets other than drones, which they have been incredibly effective at deploying. The other issue that I think Paul brings up is the fact that not only have they sort of bypassed the international structures that we've put in place to sort of regulate maritime trade, the creation of this outside economic system, combined with the fact that billions of dollars are being extracted from African countries, with so much as a passing kind of think tank response, is absolutely abhorrent. If I was the ambassador of the Ukraine, I would be throwing shoes at people, because that is exactly facilitating this particular war, as Russia is making big profits, avoiding the American financial institutions, as well as thumbing their fingers at international maritime trade, and potentially in a position to create a massive ecological disaster. I can't think of more abhorrent conduct, and it's really not being reported. I mean, amongst us sort of quasi-academics, I call myself quasi-academic. Paul is a real academic.
I claim quasi-status as well, I think.
Okay, we'll all be quasi today. But this is a massive story about how international institutions are saying a lot of things, and to President Zelensky's point, we need less saying, we need more doing, and I think this is actually the issue. Canada is pledging billions of dollars in support to Ukraine, while the Americans decide to try and tie their own internal border issues to continued funding for the Ukrainian struggle against Russia. And I guess I'm cynical in the sense is that I understand the need to pander to domestic policies and whatnot, but how can a discussion about the expansion of the Russian regime be tied to an issue that is basically a South American and Mexican issue? How can that be part of the same discussion? It shouldn't be. And so, we're at this stage where countries that want to do the right thing are encumbered by their own domestic policies to the benefit of the Russians. And then international organizations are only too happy to let Cyprus and other countries facilitate the filling the Russian coffers. If I sound a little bit indignant and outraged, I am.
Yeah, those are all great points. Mikla, do you have anything to add?
Yeah,
to that?
I have something to jump in. Thank you.
I think his connection's gone out again.
Ian was speaking about the cyber, and Paul was speaking about the maritime. And in both cases, they mentioned that Ukraine have a sufficient number of educated labor and personnel. So perhaps you need to know that every third soldier in Ukraine is ex-IT engineer, and also we have a lot of sailors. It's true what said Ian, that we have number 7th nation for sailors and captain, maritime captain. So if Ukraine will sustain, if Ukraine will prevail against Russia, we have so much to offer to Europe. We inherit this from Soviet Union. We have very educated labor. We have very educated soldiers. That's self-evident that Ukrainian soldiers can easily pick up on Western modern weaponry system because we are so educated nation. And if Ukraine will sustain this, people can be used in Europe as IT engineer or the labor, educated labor. Moreover, we have army of 1,100,000, which could be expeditionary forces of European Union if we stop the Russia. And also just think about this, like what would be the future of Ukraine in European Union? Many nations now saying that Ukraine is very agricultural country. It's true and not. See what happens now on the borders. The Polish, Slovak, and Hungary, they block and stop transport of the grain through this country into the Europe. And it's because European Union not expecting Ukraine as agriculture country in the future if we will win and we will be joining. But if we can offer you labor, educated labor, IT engineers, sailors, that would be future, bright future of Ukraine. Yeah. And also one more thing, I was so keen to listen when Ian said about something about the spy war and the Russian intelligence ops. Definitely there are a lot of evidence that Russia were trying to prepare this war from late 2000. They were spying on territory of Ukraine, they were bribing, they were trying to attract people in favor of their ideas, but it was not true. And moreover, I think the Western nations also were partly misunderstanding Ukrainian population. They were keen to see Ukrainians as a little Russians. Look at my case. I'm equally educated in UK military academy and Russian military academy. I was probably subject of Russian intel operation, but for Russian, I'm not good Russian because I was pro-Western educated. For some Western intelligence agency, I was not good enough pro-Western because I was educated in Russia. And that's the case of Ukraine. We are in the middle of something, but we are totally different to Russia. And again, Ukraine has a lot to offer to future and prosperity of European nations. Thank you for yours.
Yeah, thank you, Mikola. We're going on the top of the hour, but we actually started quite late, so I'll reserve a bit of 5 more minutes plus for some Q&A here. So we've got quite a few comments, a couple of questions. I think there are 2 questions here that one is about Hungary. So the question is, what is Hungary's angle? Viktor Orban using the war for his benefit in negotiations, or actually wants to see a limited degree of success for Putin? Any comments from them?
Well, I think Hungary is pivotal. It's an east-west place for sure. But what is interesting is they are, I would say, they're caught in the middle in a rather difficult situation. There is no love lost between the Hungarians and the Russians. The Russians were absolutely brutal in World War II to the Hungarians, and the Jewish population certainly suffered a great deal from the Nazis. I think that in general, Hungary is trying to find a middle ground between their relationship with the Western Europe powers and the Russians. Ultimately, I don't think that it's going to be their benefit. I can see it either becoming a Russian proxy state or falling into the category of Moldavia as well. So Hungary is a linchpin right now. It's a useful place to meet on what I would call almost neutral territory in some ways. But the majority of intelligence operations and trying to shape Western government's opinions and Russian government support is all playing out in Hungary. And it's really interesting to me because this looks so much like between sort of the 1750s and the 1850s historically in Europe. It's like history is repeating itself again, where the boundary states are trying to play both sides, and then sometimes they're successful and sometimes they're not. I think Hungary needs to take a gut check and think about where they want to be, if they want to be on the right side of history, to be perfectly honest. And I support Ukraine emphatically in the idea that there is a large amount of educated populace that can contribute to the economy and growth of Europe. And one thing that the economy of Europe needs right now is some growth, because the German numbers are pulling the European Union down, and there's quite a possibility of a negative growth GDP in the European region because of the German economy's struggles, or a very a very small growth number of like between 0.25 and 1%, which is just not sustainable. So it's really interesting geopolitically to take a look at Hungary, Moldavia, Belarus, and all these and all these sort of like fringe countries, and where their loyalties are going to lie. And I think honestly, it is one of those moments where there needs to be a discussion, hopefully one that results in some beneficial electoral results.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. There are two more questions, but they're actually quite related. We've got a few more minutes left. So they have to deal with that kind of pressure, basically, kind of choking off the supply lines that are kind of fueling this conflict or war that Russia is benefiting from. So the first question is, how do you address the issue of military support from Iran? And relatedly, how do you prevent alternatives to the SWIFT network and BRICS countries from reselling the oil? So anyone care to comment on that?
If I may jump in there, as Ukrainian, and we have a big Jewish population in Ukraine. Our president is Jewish, our previous minister of defense was Jewish, and we have historical roots with Jewish population and Israel. I believe Ukraine need to find a common ground with Israel to fight of behavior of Iran, which is openly start to sell their missiles to Russia and supporting the Russia. And one of the tactics which I would use geopolitically, I would definitely try to find the common ground with Israel and explain Israel and try to bring them on our side and explain it's our common interest to fight against behavior Iran and the support of Russia in this war. Thank you.
I think Israel's quite busy at the moment domestically. So, but yeah, valid points, good points. Paul, anything to add to this?
I mean, I think there's some very challenging issues which are going to come up with nations who are straddling both sides of the conflict. And I think one of the ways of looking at the conflict is it's not just geopolitical, but definitively cultural as well. And one of the things I think that strikes you when you go to Ukraine is how different Ukrainians are from Russians. That the idea that they are very similar in terms of their attitude, their temperament, their cultural predispositions, and that sort of thing is completely incorrect. I think that there is a cultural element to the conflict, which is represented by people like Orban and is more representative of the sort of split that we're seeing in Europe at the moment between a move back towards a more culturally conservative interpretation of the type of aspirations that people want, but which is being played upon very significantly by Putin in terms of radicalizing narratives on the internet, to do with the sort of 19th century Eurasianism that places the sort of religious orthodoxy and this kind of idea of a decadent West at the heart of its narratives. And I think Orban, coming from a more right-wing political tradition in Hungary, sees alignment with that type of message as being something that will appeal potentially to elements of his population. I think you then have areas like Serbia in particular, where you see the leadership there attempting to do a sort of Tito-esque maintenance of one foot in the Western camp and one foot in the Russian camp as well, which I think is bringing them under pressure and creating circumstances where they are being pressured actually to jump more towards the Russian side. And we will continue to see pressure points that the Russians can exercise in places like Kosovo and Bosnia. And I think that a settlement that the Russians would sort of stay out of those spheres of influence, the horse has already bolted on that. We are seeing Russian influence in those areas. If you look at places like Kyrgyzstan, Kyrgyz imports raised by 1,000% at the point where international sanctions were placed on Russia, giving one a key indication that they were being used as a transit country by many businesses in the West and Asia to continue trading with Russia. So again, pressure on these interim nations, each case being different, whether it's cultural, whether it's economic, whether it's geopolitical in its logic, is going to be an ongoing effort of all Western governments and their foreign policy apparatus. But I think it's going to be challenging because I think we are in a more bipolar world now. And I think the independence which has been exercised by the Russians in the establishment of alternative payment systems is giving these intermediary nations genuine options which they are looking at seriously in a way that they didn't before.
I'm so excited to get some Iran stuff in here because I did promise this when we had the initial discussions. Here's the deal about Iran. Iran is trading with Russia, full stop. The drones that the Russians are using have been manufactured in Iran. North Korea is supplying Russia. The question remains is what does Russia have to bargain with? Okay, they got some oil, but Iran has a lot of oil. So that's not really currency as far as the Iranians are concerned. The Iranians want Russian expertise. The last major war that the Iranians fought was with Iraq, and it was a long time ago in geopolitical sense because it ended, I think, in 1992 or 1991. Okay? What the Russians really want to be able to provide the Iranians is their expertise in counterinsurgency and insurgency warfare because their proxies are dying as a result of their lack of ability of the Al-Quds force to be able to train those actual proxy forces in modern warfare. So Russia is knee-deep in Iran providing military assistance, Spetsnaz, special operations forces trainers to those proxy nations. In return, they get access to Iranian technology, and it's likely that the ballistic missile transferred stuff, their own technology to the Iranians as well. It's not lost on me that when you look at South Korea and the ordnance that South Korea has been providing to the Russians, that 70% or so of the silicon, the chips that are being used in the more advanced North Korean capabilities, missile systems, are actually North American in origin. So there's an example of how sanctions, and to be fair, North Korea has been the most heavily sanctioned nation on the planet, has managed to turn blenders into cruise missiles with a startling amount of capability. So this is a group that is hell-bent on moving their political and geopolitical aspirations. And unfortunately, Ukraine is a very frequently invaded country when you look at the arc of history, and it is playing out. History is playing out once again in the same areas that in World War II with the Germans and the Russians fighting over the Ukrainian territory. There's a lot of blood there. And it's unfortunate, but it seems to be what the current arc of history is. And we have to really deal with the suppliers of this equipment and capabilities, because if we don't, we're going to be in the same position 5 or 10 years from now.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Ian. It's we're well beyond our time, but I think I'd like to have Mikola have the final word before we finish. So Mikola, it's up to you now.
Thank you for giving me the floor. But before I will say my final words, I want to say something which Paul bring up. It's about the orthodoxy religion, and it's Ukraine is not only direct front and with Russia, but it's also the Ukrainian majority of people are Christian Orthodox, but different to Russia. And Ukraine is trying to get independent church and Thomas and to be self-sustained from Russian church. And just imagine, small nation of 40 millions, number of churches measured by parishes. It's like in regiment in military terms, right? And in Ukraine, more parishes than in big Russia, which is 150 million population. So Ukraine is a more religious country and more orthodoxy countries than Russia itself. And currently there is ongoing Russian GRU operation where they try to, in United States, bring idea that Ukraine have their war on a church, on Christian church and Orthodox church in Ukraine, because Ukraine simply want to have independent church. And so the Russia GRU try to have special operation with Catholics in United States and try to influence them on election, saying that Ukraine it's again a Christian war country. But to sum up, and it's long term to discuss, to sum up, I just want to assure you that Ukraine will continue to fight. And we are very appreciative in Ukraine's support of European nation, United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, United Kingdom. We very appreciate and understand that we cannot sustain without help of European nation. We will continue our fight. History repeats itself. I'm also keen on this. And you remember when Russia collapsed, when it was Great October Revolution, Ukraine was independent for 2 years, and Entente countries, which recently defeated in 1980 Germany, they were thinking to support or not to support Ukraine. Just read about the history of 1918. So Entente decided do not support Ukraine and do not let it to become an independent country. Do not repeat the history. Let Ukraine win this year, this time, and it will change the fate of European nation as well. And thank you. That's my words from Ukraine.
Thank you, Milka. I think that's a good note to end on here. I'd like to say thank you to our experts, Ian, Mikola, Paul. Thank you for taking the time out to kind of provide your expertise, some useful insights, some useful information there. I hope a lot of our participants took away and I think you all made us a bit smarter, basically, and so in what you had to say, which is fantastic. Just some admin notes here. Well, just one note. We will make this recording available to everyone either this week or early next week. Some of the questions that we didn't get to, I think what I'll do is I will send them to all of our panelists, and they can write their individual responses. I'll then kind of send those to the people that have that asked the questions in particular. So. Without further delay, I'd like to thank everyone, our experts. I'd like to thank the participants as well for joining us, and have a great day, and we will see you all next month. Goodbye.
Goodbye, and thank you.